Russia has imposed sanctions against the United States President Joe Biden and Secretary of State Antony Blinken. The Russian Foreign Ministry also listed U.S. Secretary of State Defense Lloyd Austin and the other senior U.S. government leaders as well. The move is in response to a series of unprecedented sanctions from the United States on Russia. The sanctions would prohibit travel and freeze assets held in Russia. The Foreign Ministry also indicated that it would be maintaining official relations with Washington and, if necessary, ensure that high-level contacts with the people on the list could still take place. Well, Russia has introduced its own draft UN Security Council resolution on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. This comes a day after an earlier draft put forward by Mexico and France was moved from the Council to the General Assembly. Western nations had sought to prioritize the immediate cessation of hostilities together with unhindered humanitarian access. But after 2 weeks of negotiations, the Council process appears to have stalled. Russia's ambassador announced earlier today that it would put its own draft to the vote, and it demands the full protection of civilians and respect for international humanitarian law.
With the UN chief warning this week that Ukraine was being decimated and that the impact on civilians was reaching terrifying proportions, the main protagonist in the conflict is now putting a draft resolution on the table that condemns all violations of international humanitarian law and violations of human rights.
We made it clear that we would be prepared to adopt a humanitarian resolution. So I think that the chances are still there, and that's why we will put forward our own draft, which is humanitarian, and we will put it into the blue shortly, and we'll see whether the Security Council can or cannot fulfill its mission to adopt a resolution which will be on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine with clear humanitarian provision like call for negotiated ceasefire, evacuation of civilians, respect of international humanitarian and human rights law, condemnation of attacks against civilians and civilian objects, safe and unhindered passage, unhindered access of humanitarian assistance, etc.
Moscow has accused Ukraine of firing a Toshka-U missile it says killed 23 people in a residential area of the separatist region of Donetsk, an allegation denied by Ukraine, but put to the UN Secretary-General yesterday.
I've seen the news about this incident, and I have to say that our position is very clear. Any attack on civilians or civilian infrastructure is regrettable if accidental and condemnable if done on purpose. But let's be clear, the overwhelming majority of civilian casualties and the overwhelming majority of civilian infrastructure destructed was done in the context of the war by the Russian forces.
A view the Russians have taken umbrage at.
We are very much concerned how UN officials, including the top ones, including the Secretary General, including Under Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo, are assessing the situation in Ukraine, accusing Russia of indiscriminate attacks. Secretary General yesterday said that although that attack is condemnable, the most of the destruction comes from the Russian sources, as if he was comparing two events and implying that that attack didn't deserve condemnation.
You've been very critical, Russia has been very critical.
We also pressed the ambassador on the parallels being drawn between the unilateral actions of the United States in Iraq in 2003 and Russia's unilateral actions in Ukraine.
Every situation is unique, but I do not recall the level of outrage, hysterics that U.S. invasion of Iraq.
They tried to get Kofi Annan fired.
Sorry?
They tried to get Kofi Annan fired, so I would argue they were greater hysterics.
No resolutions, nothing, if you remember. No resolution of the Security Council, nothing that would be comparable to what we're experiencing today.
The Russian draft expected to be put to a vote within the next 24 hours.
I haven't seen any Russian proposal, but just to repeat, Ireland's concern is to make sure that the causes of the humanitarian crisis are also taken into account as we address what is a dire situation on the ground.
Another council diplomat telling us that there was concern that Russia would have again vetoed the French and Mexican-led draft resolution on humanitarian access because it contained political language around a cessation of hostilities. As council members now digest an alternative text put forward by Russia that also endorses a call by the Secretary-General for a return to negotiations and a negotiated ceasefire in a moment of irony for those closely watching developments on the ground. Shervin Briceby's SABC News, New York.
Well, for a little bit more on the latest developments, we're now joined by Professor at the Faculty of Political Science and International Studies of the University of Warsaw, Professor Andrey Sheptisky, who joins us now from Poland. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Professor. Welcome to the program.
Good evening. Thank you for inviting me.
All right. So let's start with the sanctions that Moscow has imposed on President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau. Are these largely symbolic? Why do you think that Russia has done this?
Well, they are very symbolic, but they are very strong, if I may say so. Until very recently, well, starting from Crimea 2014, even if there were sanctions on both sides, personal sanctions, they would not directly touch the leadership, Russia, Putin, or Western leaders. So you would have some people, some experts, some activists who would be forbidden from entering Russia or from entering EU, US, but not the top leadership. So now we are politically, symbolically, we are on the next level. We don't want anymore to see the respective leaders of these countries on the other side of the border.
Is this a good or a bad thing for Russia? Because it's escalating rather than de-escalating, and we're in a situation where we should be going in the other direction, things calming down rather than getting bigger.
Well, but, you know, Putin, I fully agree with you, but unfortunately Putin does not. Putin doesn't want to de-escalate. He started this war with no reason, breaking the basic norms of international law. And despite calls from the international community, now he is continuing this conflict. He is continuing destroying Ukraine, committing war crimes, and so on. So once again, he doesn't want de-escalation. He wants to take control of Ukraine, preferably entire country, or he wants to destroy it if he is not able to control it, and he will not. He will not stop.
So, you know, a lot of people are probably wondering, what is it about Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, that has got the world mobilized in a way that it hasn't since perhaps World War II?
There are two or three reasons. First, it didn't happen. Well, in fact, probably since 1990, the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq. It didn't happen that there was one country which directly invaded another country, trying to take control of it. We had intervention of NATO in Kosovo, which on the ground of the international law was quite questionable, but it was not about taking control of entire Serbia, okay? We had several other wars since 1990, but never, well, we had Crimea in 2014, but there was never such a situation, at least since Iraq-Kuwait conflict in 1990. And well, another reason is, we have to keep that in mind, Ukraine is simply a big country, like Russia is a great power. So it's not a kind of one country. Few people heard about invading a smaller country, even less people heard about, but it's a conflict between two major countries, okay? Ukraine is the biggest country in Europe if you don't take into account such countries like Russia or Turkey, which are between Europe and Asia. And well, last point, which is especially important when you look from Warsaw or from Brussels, Ukraine is a direct neighbor of EU, is a direct neighbor of NATO. So for us here, this is important, well, simply for geographic reasons. Now we are having in Poland more than 1 million of refugees from Ukraine. For last 3 weeks, 1.8 million Ukrainians crossed Polish-Ukrainian border. Some of them already left to other countries, but majority of them is staying currently in Poland. This is the biggest humanitarian crisis we had, at least in Europe, since the Second World War. This is something we have not experienced in Europe for last 60, 70 years.
The countries are now trying to reach some kind of peace agreement, trying to get to a point where a ceasefire might or might not happen. I just wonder if you're optimistic that some kind of progress will be made, given that this is a situation that's playing quite hard for both sides.
I'm not very optimistic. So I would not say a kind of peaceful settlement is impossible, but I would say it is improbable. This war is not about, some concrete, limited dispute. It's not about a province. It's not about, access to water. It's about the existence of independent Ukraine on one hand, and it is about imperial identity of Russia. And also about the survival of Putin. And of Zelensky, by the way, probably also. And so this is an existential conflict, and for that reason, I don't think a real peaceful settlement will be reached. Of course, they may agree for a kind of ceasefire to prepare both sides for the next round. This is more probable. It would be very important to reach an agreement on humanitarian corridors, because some cities like Kharkiv, like Mariupol, are now currently in a catastrophic situation. No heating. We have now winter, which in Ukraine may be still quite harsh. So no heating, no water, no food, no electricity. And especially these two cities I have mentioned, Kharkiv and Mariupol, are in a really disastrous situation. They've been heavily touched by the Russian bombardment, by Russian rockets. They are encircled by the Russian forces. Some people, but not too many, were able to get out of these cities. So this is really a short-term priority with no direct kind of influence on the settlement of the conflict. But humanitarian corridors are really something we badly need.
You said that it's not about anything specific and not about lands, but what about then Lugansk and Donetsk? Is that not a specific issue that's been running for a while that will still need to be resolved?
Well, it is a concrete issue, I agree, but a minor one. If you read the article of Putin he published last year in July, if I'm not mistaken, if you listen what he was saying about Ukraine, for the last 15 years, what he was saying about the tragedy of collapse of Soviet Union, you will understand Putin simply doesn't want an independent Ukraine to exist. He is furious on it because of so-called Orange Revolution in 2004, when people went out to the streets to defend free elections. He is furious about the so-called Euromaidan in 2013-14, when the pro-Russian Yanukovych lost the power after massive protests. He is very afraid also that such revolution might happen in Moscow and he may lose power. So he wants, as I've already said, he wants either to subjugate Ukraine or to destroy it. And the fate of Lugansk and Donetsk, so-called People's Republics, it's only a pretext. Crimea has a symbolic historical value for Russia, yes. And that's why it was completely illegally incorporated into the Russian Federation. But Donetsk and Lugansk, puppet states, this is something of secondary importance. Putin would like to come back to Kiev. Kiev, he considers, was the cradle not only of Ukrainian statehood, he doesn't believe in, but Kiev, according to Putin, was in fact the cradle of Russian statehood. And that's why it should be one way or the other under the control of Moscow.
The Russian ambassador to the United Nations said that he was surprised at all the hysterics and the excitement that the Americans in particular have shown, and that the world didn't condemn America as much when they went into Iraq. I'm just wondering, look, this war will end at some point. I think everybody knows that. What the result might be is what we don't know. But what will happen to Putin after that? Because he can't just go back to life as it was. He's always going to be the guy who invaded Ukraine. Will that mean that the Putin after this war will be diminished in the world, or what do we see post this war? Because it will end, but the consequences of what he's done surely will remain.
Well, he is already diminished. He deserves to be sent to the International Criminal Court to be judged for the war crimes Russian army has just committed. Okay, so it's not very probable, this scenario, although it's not impossible. Please keep in mind that former dictator of Chile, Pinochet, he was arrested when he traveled one day to Spain. After some time, he was released because he was already very old, but still such precedents happened in history. A former dictator being arrested outside his country. But most probably, if Putin does not lose power in a brutal way, in a bloody way, most probably he will spend the end of his days in Russia. He has built for himself a sumptuous, how shall I call it, residence, palace on the Black Sea, which is currently heavily protected by the Russian security forces so that no ordinary citizen access this territory. He has a reserve of wine bottles. He has his own private cinema and several other facilities. So once again, that's probably how he imagines his future when he leaves Kremlin, where he would like to stay at least 2036. So still 14 years, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
He wants to stay in power.
All right, perhaps as a final question, the Prime Ministers of Poland, Slovenia and Czech Republic have arrived into a country that is in the middle of a war, and their safety can't be guaranteed to meet with President Zelensky. How significant is this?
Well, symbolically, it's important. It shows the support of Central European countries for Ukraine. They are unofficially also representing the EU, so it also shows the support of EU. So it's important, but it's only symbolic, or it's only symbolic, but it is important. Whatever version you prefer. Well, I mean, the fact we are now speaking about that, okay, a few thousand kilometers from Kiev, it shows the importance of that visit. That's why they went there to remind the world about that bloody war.
Professor, thank you so much indeed for joining us. Your insights greatly appreciated tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Good night. All right, that's Professor Sheptisky, who's joining us from Poland, speaking about the sanctions that have been imposed on the United States President and the Prime Minister in Canada by Russia. They're not allowed to enter Russia. Now, in the meantime,